So you didn't have to do this, but I took a little bit to actually render these out. At least on my computer, it took about a minute per frame. There's no motion blur, which helps it finish much faster. But I did use the higher quality settings otherwise. And yeah, so there you go. It looks like this. Pretty cool. It'll definitely feel different when there is motion blur, but without it, you can see more of the detail anyway. So it's good for our analyzing these purposes right now. We can see the diffuse vorticity here. That's now you kind of maybe feel the idea more, where it's trying to emulate lots of little bubbles, which is why it's more diffuse. It's not clear in these areas. We'll put actual whitewater in this as foam into this as well. We're also going to get to the wet maps so that we have a wet residue in these areas that the water passes over and leaves. But what I want to do right now is add more perceived detail to the surface of the liquid. Right now, the light reflects off of this based on the surface normals. And you should well know by now what normals are. They are vectors that stick out perpendicular from the surface. Now, there's a time-honored tradition in shading, material setups and whatnot, of normal maps and bump maps, which are kind of a more simplified version of that. Essentially saying that we acknowledge that these lighting calculations are based off of the orientation of the surface, which is usually derived from the surface of the geometry. But what if we just had the same surface of the geometry, but we just messed with what the normals were, as if they were representing small changes in the geometry across the surface? So that's what we want to do. We want to set up essentially a bump map across the top of the water to add small detail. And we can't add big detail with this. If we were to add normals facing, let's say, in a ring shape around here, we could give the impression that there's a spherical surface on here. But if I did that on the side, the silhouette of this rock here, we could clearly see that there is no geometry there. I want to see the silhouette of that extra little detail. So the bump and normal maps will only get us so much extra here. Just small things to break up these big washes of light. We can break it up a little bit and it will seem like there's more detail, especially again when it's in motion blur. So how do we do that? Well, we can't literally paint a bump map, obviously, as the water's moving all the time. We also can't just use a noise and say animate the noise in this direction, because the water, it moves around the rock. We need whatever noise we do end up using, because we will actually use a pattern. It needs to flow with the water. We need to see those bumps moving with the water. Otherwise, it would look very silly. So what we have is this idea. You can ignore that for a second. I'm going to disable our simulation also. What we have is the rest and rest2 attributes, which we set up before we did our cache, or at least I warned you several times to do that. Under the particle motion rest tab, we said add rest attribute. In fact, we made 2 of them, and they switch every 25 frames. So what does that mean? The rest attribute essentially is snapshotting where everybody is on a given frame, and then as the water moves, it remembers where it came from, and it uses where it came from to look up into the noise that we want to use. So I have many flipbooks here to illustrate this. So the ultra naive approach is to literally have a Voronoi, let's say, for example, and I'm going to use Voronoi because this actually is the pattern we end up using for this. And let me also say, before we get any farther, this is set up already on the basic liquid shader, and hopefully any future versions of the liquid shader, as I imagine they will rewrite it someday. We have this thing here called vorticity waves, which once again will use the vorticity attribute to drive a bump map that has this scale and height. Scale meaning the size of the waves. So what I'm about to show you is already in the shader, but I want you to understand how it works, because there's all kinds of reasons why you might want to alter it yourself or just understand what's even happening here. So, getting back to this. The very naive approach is to simply look up the current position of the surface into a unchanging Voronoi field, which would look like this. Obviously that's wrong. this isn't moving with the liquid. But essentially what that looks like is the position, the current position, looks up into the Voronoi noise. This output, the seed output, is just a random number that's, I mean, it's consistent within a cell. I turn that into a random color and then visualize it. So there you go. So we can close that one. So a better approach is to start using these rest attributes. So essentially, instead of looking up the current position, we look up that rest attribute. And that drives everything else in the same manner. So that's what this looks like. So now we have on the first frame or so that initial Voronoi pattern, but now it moves with the water. It goes around the rock. The problem is, the further we go, it gets very dirty. It gets very like, we don't really see anything anymore. I mean, it was cool having the pattern move, like here, but eventually we don't see anything. It's just noise. So what we say is we want this to reset every some amount of frames. Now again, I said for us, because it's pretty fast moving, every 25 frames between the reset. So we get this. That way, it gets back to a clean state where it now says, take a new snapshot on this frame of where everybody is. And now, as the points continue to advect, they move, and then, you know, every 25 frames, you'll keep seeing these pops for the reset. So that solves one problem and creates another. I mean, it pops. Obviously, we would see this in our render. So we can't do that either. So what we do is we have two of them. They alternate. They leapfrog each other, essentially. Every 25 frames, it resets, but halfway between that 25 frames, the other rest attribute resets. So they keep going back and forth, dueling rests. So here, in this configuration, we read our rest, and then this one's doing the exact same thing with the rest too. But again, this is staggered. This is offset 12.5 frames, or whatever half of this is. So we have the same Voronoi pattern. They make the color, but now there's a weighted average to say which one to use. We want to weight all the way towards the one that is not resetting at this moment. So on the very frame that they reset, we are only looking at one, and then as that one heads towards a reset, we are only looking at the other. That's what this rest ratio is. If we look at that detail attribute, you'll just simply see it's two numbers that add up to 1. So it's a weighted average that ping-pongs back and forth. So what does that look like? Well, that pretty much gets us there, in fact. So we blend back and forth between these two, so we always have something. We always have some pretty clear looking pattern here. It's not 100% ideal, but this is what we get. We're trying to add detail in a clever way. I mean, the best way is to simply do a higher resolution sometimes, although, again, that introduces problems, as I started to say earlier. So this is a good way to do it if you can, and a necessary way to do it if you don't have enough RAM. In any case, in our actual renders, when it looks like this, you won't be able to tell that one thing is blending on and off. If you could actually see this difference, it would be pretty bad. What it ends up looking like is not like this, though. Close that one. So that was both, which I said, like it did the blend back and forth between the two, the weighted average. What we actually end up using is this. Instead of the Voronoi, like random color pattern, we do this thing instead, which is we look at it's still Voronoi, but we look at this output, dist1. Dist1 is a grayscale that simply records how far are we from the edge of the cell. So what does this kind of look like? Well, it kind of looks like a wave pattern a little bit. So towards the edge, it's white because we're right on the edge, and then towards the middle, it's black. So here's that. Again, looking like something. We actually use it. We raise it to a power of 3, or the shader does anyway, to make the bright spots bright and the dark spots drop off faster. So then we have this where we blend between the two. So it's kind of hard. It's a little harder to tell that it's doing that blending back and forth. It kind of just looks like wave action. I still can see a little bit though. So finally, we just simply make the frequency higher because we want small waves. We don't want those giant waves anyway. Another way that we're not even going to see it. So we end up with this. Now it's very hard to tell that it's blending back and forth. Except for the first frames, which we're never going to see because that's part of the pre-roll. We start here at 48, remember? So it ends up looking like this. Now it's virtually impossible to tell that it is blending back and forth between the two of them. And this is what's going to be used to add our detail on the surface. You know, these white areas will simulate there being, you know, more peaks, higher waves there, and it'll be lower here. So it's going to modulate our original thing by this. Now, I should also say, this is a geometry representation where we are literally coloring each point. There's only so much resolution on the surface. So, you know, when we have things like this where it just looks like modeled or just like dots, just noise, it actually will be more crisp and clear in the render. Because the render is going to do these lookups per pixel in our image. Right now, we're doing it only per point in the geometry, of which there is far less. So you can see gaps between them because that's how few there are. If this was a high-res sim, you'd see it better, but the point is that it doesn't actually matter. You don't need it to be a high-res sim. At render time is when it will look up this stuff. This is not, we're not using this rest demo geometry node that I made here. All of this is in the basic liquid already. If we dive into this jumble here is that. It's literally everything that we just talked about. It's the Voronoi noise, it's the rest attribute, it's the rest ratio, it's the weighted average of it. It's all here already, with the exception that this Voronoi noise, you know, again, it does this at the shader level. So we will get as much detail as we need out of it there. All right, so that is how it works, and now let's actually use it.